Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's subject in our history of revolutionary ideas is a big one. I'm talking to the historian and podcaster Tom Holland about what changed in human understanding and human experience with the advent of Christianity. It's a lot to try and cover in a single episode, but we're going to give it a go. Tom, I'm not going to ask you whether Christianity is a revolutionary idea, because I think we're going to take it as read that it is. And I want to ask you about the nature of the revolution that you think Christianity brought about. And I want to start by just giving two possibilities. I'm sure there are many others, but just two ways of thinking about this question. One of which is the thought that the essence of the revolutionary element in Christianity is the initial explosion, the way in which the world in which it first appeared, was inverted by it, its values, its understanding. It turned on its head most of the conventional ideas of the time. Weakness is strength. The meek shall inherit the earth. The last will be first. The first will be last. Suffering is a kind of glory, and so on. The second, and this is to borrow a phrase from you, it's not the initial explosion. It's thinking of it as a kind of depth charge, something that rumbles through the centuries. And what makes it so revolutionary is that over the centuries, the millennia, it changes everything, and in so doing, it's always having to change itself. And it's that sort of propulsion that does it. Now, there may be many other possibilities here too.
Well, I think they're both true.
So let's start with the first. They're both true, and other things are true as well. We are talking about Christianity. But if we start with the first, what for you is the essence of the revolutionary inversion? Which idea or ideas are the thing that you can say upended the world in which Christianity emerged?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasize is that Christianity doesn't come from, it's not kind of lightning from a clear blue sky. Nothing comes from nothing. And it's clearly a cultural product of all kinds of, it's like a great lake into which many streams have fed. And the most obvious of those is the inheritance of Hebrew scripture, of Judean practice. Then, of course, there's the impact of Greece, of Greek philosophy, which again is, I think initially on Paul, you can trace it, but over the course of certainly late antique Christianity becomes very significant. In the background, there is Persian ideas of dualism, the idea that the world is divided into rival spheres of good and evil, that there's a kind of moral dimension at play in the cosmos and therefore on the earth, which certainly influences the way that the Judeans come to understand their God and their relationship to that God and the functioning of the universe. And then, of course, there is Rome. And Rome is a self-proclaimed universalist empire. It says that its empire properly has no limits, but also practically it creates a kind of a single unitary power within which people can move far more readily than they've been able to before. And that obviously creates a form of globalization in which peoples and ideas and understandings of the universe and humanity's place within it can mix and merge. So that, I think, is absolutely crucial to lay out first. But having said that, I think it's more than the sum of its parts. There is a strangeness to it, which I think is profoundly unsettling. And I think ultimately the strangeness is rooted most deeply in narratives. And some of those narratives are inherited from the Hebrew scriptures. But there is also the revolutionary drama, as Christians frame it, of a man who in some way comes to be seen as part of the one creator of the universe, who does not come as a conqueror, does not come as a great prince, but ends up suffering the most horrific of fates. He suffers death on a cross, and then Christians believe he rises from the dead. And this is recognized from the beginning by Christian writers as the kind of strange molten heart of this radical new teaching that they are proclaiming. And we know that because the very earliest Christian writer whose letters we have, Paul, focuses in on this. And he says that, if Christ is not crucified, then everything I'm saying is nonsense. And he identifies that the idea that this man who was in some way divine, and I think Paul is, in his letters, is clearly struggling to understand quite what that means, but he does recognize it as being such. And he says it's going to be a stumbling block to his fellow Judeans. And it's a stumbling block in all kinds of ways, because obviously for Judeans, the idea that the one God could in some way become mortal is a shocking idea. And it opens up all kinds of radical new ways of understanding the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly the covenant that the Judeans believe they have with God, and which was given to them in stone form to Moses on Mount Sinai. And Paul is very self-consciously kind of upending all that. But Paul also says, and Paul seems to have been a Roman citizen, he writes in Greek, he's clearly very familiar with the world of what he would call the Gentiles, the Greeks and the Romans. He says to them, look, this idea is madness. It's insanity. And the reason that for the Romans it's insane is absolutely not the idea that a man could be a god, because the Romans are completely familiar with that. And the fastest growing cult in the age of Jesus is that of Augustus, who, like Jesus, is seen by his admirers as the son of a god, in Augustus's case, Julius Caesar. He's a prince of peace who brings order to the world. It's proclaimed as euangelion, good news, evangel. And when he dies, he ascends to heaven and is seated at the right hand of his divine Father. So that's not particularly weird to the Romans. But what is weird is the idea that this guy who's become a god is not a great emperor. He's not the ruler of the world. He's not a general who has subdued his enemies. He is someone who has suffered the fate that the Romans see as being stereotypically that of a slave, because crucifixion is the worst death they can imagine. A governor in a province faced with rebels can sentence them to fire or to be fed to the beasts or to be crucified. And the assumption is that crucifixion is the worst, partly because it's the most protracted, but also because it's the most humiliating. You cannot be crucified and retain any dignity whatsoever. And so the fact that Christians proclaim that someone who has suffered that fate, the fate of a slave, is in fact a king and the king of the world, and has triumphed over death, and by extension has triumphed over all the power of Rome, and that the cross therefore is an emblem not of humiliation but of triumph and of victory. That is symbolically, morally, culturally, mythologically so mad that I think it's the heart of the revolution that Paul is preaching, and which Christianity continues to uphold to this day.
And of course, as Nietzsche said, this is a philosophy, an idea that is going to therefore appeal to people who are themselves suffering, indeed people who are themselves slaves. So there is also in this the radicalism of a form of salvation that is going to be made available to potentially at least everyone. And as you said, this is also a universal religion in a world that's thinking of itself as a universe, and yet it's a personal religion. So it's that combination. So it was a world of gods and a world of personal gods, but the point about personal gods is they were on the whole personal, and the universal God who created all and is the origin of the laws of nature was an impersonal God. And somehow these two things are fused.
I mean, you say it's a religion. One of the things that prompted me to become interested in Christianity and to think about just how transformative it was that I was writing about pre-Christian cultures, Greece, Rome, Persia, whatever. And again, I found that English words were kind of pregnant with a sense of anachronism. And I kept kind of thinking, well, why do they seem so anachronistic? And I came to realize that it was because they were completely freighted with Christian assumptions. And I guess religion is an absolutely classic example of that, because you will read books about, say, ancient Greece, and there'll be a chapter on Greek religion, and it will be treated as something separate from chapters on the functioning of the democracy or war or the role of women or whatever. But this understanding of there being things called religions, which are separate from a space called the secular, is itself a product of this great rolling kind of tsunami of change that Christianity is introducing to the world. And in a sense, the evolution of the idea of a religion and the idea of the secular, which is so fundamental to our way of thinking in the West, that we don't really realize how exceptional it is on a kind of global scale. I mean, it's very distinctively a product of Western Christianity, but also in the historical sense. And so part of the challenge, I think, of recognizing how radical Christianity is that you can impose Christian assumptions onto the world into which Christianity is born. Because actually, there is no word in Latin or Greek or Hebrew for what we would call a religion, even though it derives from a Latin word religio, which to the Romans is literally a bond. It's something that joins humans to the dimension of the divine. So a religio might be a sacrifice or establishment of a temple or a cult or whatever, something like that. So there are multiple religiones. And to the Romans and to the Greeks and to most of the peoples of antiquity, the relationship to the gods is very transactional. You offer a god a religio, and in return, the god looks after you. And if things then go wrong, then it's clear that you haven't been keeping up with your religiones. But what Christianity does is to sweep all that away, to say that, as the Judeans do, as the people the Jews, that there is only the one God. But as you say, that relationship is something that is kind of personal. You have to personally choose him. And you can see, I think, even before Christianity comes to be established, that there are people in the Roman world who are very attracted by this in the kind of Judean cult, as they would see it. This idea of a God who can be a personal God, who can care for you, who might love you, who might establish a covenant with you. And essentially, in the world that Jesus is born into, what the Greeks would call Judaismos, kind of Judeanness, the culture of being a Judean, is like a kind of bandwidth. And one end of that, the Judeans emphasize their God as the God of Israel, the God of a particular people. But at the other end of it, there are Judeans who emphasize God as the creator of all the world and all human beings within it, and therefore a God for everyone. And essentially what Christianity does is to kind of take over that end of the spectrum. And because Paul says there is a new covenant, it's a covenant that you can feel in the heart, in the synodesis, the kind of the conscience, as the Stoics call it, the spark of the divine that exists potentially within every human being. That then sweeps away all the kind of markers of the previous covenant, the circumcision, the food taboos, and so on. And that obviously makes it much easier for Gentiles to convert to it, to take it up, particularly for men, I guess.
How much of that strangeness, that feeling that there was something mad that had been introduced into the world, had to do with, so I don't know whether this is anachronistic or not, but it's paradoxical quality. So there is in the core tenets of this, let's call it this new idea, not religion, this new idea.
Well, maybe this new story, this new mythology, perhaps.
This new story, right? So it's a story which says that, so there is glory, there is salvation in suffering. Maybe that's not paradoxical, that's just deeply strange. But there is strength in weakness. We get closer to things where the ideas seem to be pulling against each other, that the universal is also the personal, and that there is a story now which, part of its propulsive power is it's going to kind of eat itself, because within it are the ideas that are going to require it to move forward. Because, let's take in weakness, there is strength, right? When it manifests as strength, that creates the opportunity for people to say it's no longer weakness and the weak can be set against it again. But did that paradoxical quality strike people very early?
I'm trying to remember from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think there was a spaceship that was powered by paradox. There was a kind of paradox generator. And I think that's what Christianity is. It kind of weaponizes paradox. So as you say, the idea that weakness can be a source of strength, that an emblem of the right of a great power to torture to death those who oppose it can become an emblem of the power of those who are tortured over the great empire. And the idea that the last shall be first, the first shall be last. Paradox is everywhere you look. The idea that a man can be a god can become a man. I mean, paradox is everywhere. And you absolutely put your finger on one of the key paradoxes, which has kind of shadowed the entire history of Christianity from the beginning. And again, it goes back to Paul. The more I think about Paul, his letters seem to me by far the most radical and influential texts that have survived from antiquity. They're like kind of, as you said, kind of depth charges that just keep going off and keep rippling out, under the subsoil of our culture. But he famously writes to the Galatians and he says, there's no man or woman, there's no slave or free, there's no Greek or Jew in Christ Jesus, i.e., the traditional distinctions that in part had been upheld by the Mosaic covenant are dissolved. And I mean, essentially, this is the foundational text for our multiculturalism, for our kind of liberal universalism, the idea that it's a positive that divisions be dissolved into a kind of common identity. But as Paul finds out, there are plenty of his countrymen who don't want to see their distinctiveness dissolved into what they would see as a kind of mush. And so they don't accept his euangelion, his good news. And we know long term what the consequences of that will be. And as you say, the more that Christianity spreads, the more it becomes the faith of emperors and kings and great warriors, the more it is spread beyond the limits of its traditional heartlands to new continents that, the gospel writers never imagined would exist. So the paradox of a universalism that has to deal with peoples who don't accept its universalism become more and more troubling. And that obviously remains a problem for those kind of traditions that are the heirs of Christianity, of which I would absolutely include liberalism.
It's another way of putting that this is a story that says that everybody can be saved. But it's not a story that says everybody will be saved. It's more, anybody could, but not everybody will. It's not that we are born saved in this story. We acquire salvation in one form or another. We can, lots of variations on that theme. But that tension, that ripples through the millennia, that this is both a religion of the universe and the universal, and becomes a religion, I'm using that word again, of the elect, of the saved. And that tension is a big part of what keeps this thing exploding, isn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it kind of generates all kinds of very momentous theological fervor. Was it Keynes who said that bluff, sensible men who think they're proclaiming self-evident common sense are often the slaves of defunct economists? And I increasingly think that progressives who proclaim their contempt for Christianity as superstition are themselves the slaves of defunct theologians. We all are, in a sense. So Constantine famously is converted, and the Roman Empire starts to become Christian, and North Africa becomes the showground for a kind of momentous conflict that completely shapes the history of, certainly of Latin Europe. And it's bred of debates about whether church leaders who betray the church, who have, in the period of persecution that preceded the coming to power of Constantine, had handed over their holy texts, their scriptures, which gives us the word traitor, people who hand things over. Can they minister the sacraments or not? And this generates a kind of violent doctrinal civil war in Africa that rumbles throughout the 4th and 5th centuries. And it focuses the idea of whether salvation is for those who are pure, those who have can absolutely look into their hearts and know that they are doing the right thing, or whether it is for the vast mass of people who may often have committed grievous sins. And again, you can see the future contours of Western politics waiting to sprout from that. And it's given a further refinement by the fact that the greatest late antique figure of North Africa, African Christianity, Augustine, he kind of gets engaged with Britain's first intellectual, a monk called Pelagius. And they kind of slightly recalibrate this argument. And Pelagius preaches that humans can attain salvation by their own will, that if they do good works, if their heart is pure enough, they can attain heaven without the need of a church or without the need of God's grace. And Augustine opposes this very radically and formulates the kind of hugely momentous doctrine of original sin, which is seismically important on the future development of the West. And he says that everyone has sin, and therefore you are dependent on grace. And how and why that grace is bestowed is a mystery known only to God. And that is something that often, I think, strikes people today as a kind of repellent notion, the idea that all human beings, all kind of, even the tiniest baby is born with sin. But it's actually a very democratic notion, because what Pelagianism breeds is a kind of purity spiral that results in sinners being condemned to the fire in the utter conviction that those who are condemning them are themselves pure. Whereas if we're all sinners, none of us can be pure. Ultimately, we're all dependent on grace for salvation. And actually, that seems to me, in a way, bizarrely, paradoxically, again, a kind of more optimistic doctrine.
That phrase, purity spiral, I think we can all think of our own 21st century versions of it playing out in our own culture. But it also makes me think of another word, which is there at the beginning. So it's in the origin of this story. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. It appears twice in the Sermon on the Mount, which is the word hypocrisy. And so I don't know what we should call it. Is it a paradox? Is it a tension? But one of the things that's going on right in the Sermon on the Mount, where we are being told, don't be a hypocrite. And hypocrisy here means, it's a word borrowed from the Greek, but it means making a parade of your virtue. It meant just sort of acting on a stage and pretending to be something you're not. But here it's kind of parading your virtue, and you're told not to do that. But you're also told not to hide your light. You are told to be a light unto the world. So you're not to parade who you are, who you think you are, and at the same time, you're to let people see who you truly are. And that's going to be devilishly hard to do, because hypocrisy is almost built into that story. It's almost built into these paradoxes. You are to be weak because this is the story for the weak, but there is strength in that weakness. But as soon as it becomes strength, it becomes a kind of double standard. And it does sometimes feel to me that one of the things that makes Christianity so propulsive as an idea is the way in which it's very clear that hypocrisy is sin, and it makes it impossible to avoid it. So that in every version of what then becomes this religion, there is the opportunity for the so-called pure at heart to accuse others of hypocrisy. And the cycle and the circle goes on. That is part of the purity spiral. It's a story that says at the beginning, don't be a hypocrite, and also tells you to lead a paradoxical life.
Right, because so many of the kind of the commandments that Jesus gives in the Gospels are basically impossible to follow. They're kind of oxymoronic. Love your enemies. You can't love your enemy, by definition. And I suppose, again, that's providing ballast for the doctrine of original sin, that if we can't hope to achieve the standards that are set for us, we're all doomed to fail. The best we can do is to try. But of course, that generates an inherent instability in the frameworks of cultures that come to be kind of saturated in Christian teachings. And I think that there's an obvious contrast both with kind of Jewish notions of how to lead a good life and with Muslim ones. And Muslim scholars were not in the habit of reading the New Testament because they assumed that the New Testament was a corrupted text that had been altered by Christians to disguise the fact that Jesus had actually been a Muslim. But there are Muslim scholars who do read it, and they're utterly bewildered by it. They say, what the hell is this? There are no laws at all. It's just a bloke doing, turning water into wine and things like that. There are no instructions of how to live at all, because to a Muslim, a good life must be prescribed by a written law. God has given his law, his kind of blueprint for how he wants humans to live, to his prophets and to the seal of the prophets, Muhammad. And therefore, a Muslim who wants to know how he or she should live can go to the sayings of the prophet or to meditations on the Quran and know exactly how they should live. But it seems to me that, again, at the kind of the molten heart of Christianity is the unbelievably enigmatic character of Christ as he is portrayed in the Gospels. Because one of the things you notice is, when you read them through, is that he is constantly subverting any notion that humans can operate according to an absolutely stable framework of laws. So we've both of us fixed on this notion of the last being first, the idea that there is a kind of moral quality in not being rich. It is Lazarus at the gates of the rich man's house who is saved, and Dives who is not. The young man, the rich young man who asks, how can I be saved, is told to go away and give all his belongings to the poor, and he says he can't, and, illustrates that it's like a camel trying to pass through the eye of a needle. So you'd think that's a secure doctrine. But then there's this kind of episode where Jesus is sitting there and there's a kind of massively expensive foot ointment being rubbed on his feet. And the apostle, some of the apostles say, well, what's going on? Shouldn't we be selling this and giving the money to the poor? And Jesus says, you'll always have the poor with you, but you won't have me for very long. And that's kind of always seems to be a kind of paradigmatic example that Jesus is always, in the Gospels, is always kind of subverting the idea that you can have that kind of certainty. And the consequence of that in turn, and also the kind of Pauline maneuver of saying that the new covenant is written on the heart. So you have to look into the heart and read your conscience to get the law that for Jews or Muslims has been supplied to them by God. It generates a kind of maybe a legal and moral instability that encourages people within Christendom always to be stress testing the kind of dispensations that they have, saying, is this actually what we should be doing? Could we not perhaps do better? And particularly in the West, in the Latin church, they kind of stumble across this very radical notion that it's not just individuals who can be baptized and be washed clean of their sins, but perhaps, all of society. And this generates in the 11th century a process that they call reformatio, the remaking of the whole of the world, kind of led by radicals who seize control of the commanding heights of the bishopric of Rome. And the 11th century and into the 12th century witnesses Europe's first great experience of societal reformatio, revolution. And the civilization of the Middle Ages, high Middle Ages in Latin Christendom, is the opposite of hidebound and reactionary. It is Europe's first revolutionary society, but in the long run, it serves to breed further revolution because, of course, there are people, in the 14th, in the 15th, certainly in the 16th centuries, who look at the church that has been forged out of this first great process of reformatio and say, well, it's become corrupt, it's monstrous, it's literally satanic. And that generates a further round of reformatio, the great process of change that we call the Reformation. And then I think going into the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, you can see increasing iterations of that. But the more that they carry on, the less they become self-consciously, doctrinally Christian. And often they're very opposed overtly to Christianity. But I think you can see that familiar dynamic at operation. I mean, right the way up to whatever it is we're going through at the moment.
And that generates, this is a phrase that you use in Dominion, not the phrase I'm about to say, which is it generates a kind of historical paradox. But the phrase that you use is that there are all of these people who think that Christianity has become hidebound and they are not going to be bound by tradition, and they're going to think it through for themselves. They're going to look into their own hearts. They may, in their own mind, step outside of the bounds of Christianity in order to do this, in order to reform it. So they are not going to be bound by tradition. And as you say, that is the Christian tradition. So there's your historical paradox. The tradition is not to be bound by tradition. Now that is, again, I don't know if revolutionary is the word, but it's a deeply destabilizing idea because you are always going to be churning if your tradition is to reject tradition.
Right. And that, again, is an index of just how revolutionary Christianity is, because in a sense, it creates the idea of revolution as being a positive, because this idea that you can, that there can be a new Jerusalem and that this is to be welcomed is something that would have been deeply shocking to people in antiquity. So for the Romans, change is basically bad. So res novae, new things, is demonstrably an awful thing. I mean, who would possibly want that? Nobody would want that. And the idea that you can upend things and improve yourself, I mean, it's just an idea that nobody has. So, of course, there is change in the Roman world. I mean, it's a very adaptive, very successful society at adapting to its changing circumstances, but it's always framed as being a reversion to ancient tradition. So even Caesar, when he's kind of trampled down the Republic and he's scouting around for a way to disguise his autocracy. He doesn't call himself a king. I mean, he doesn't proclaim the end of the Republic, but he goes back through Republican tradition and he comes up with this office, the dictator, who is appointed at times of crisis. He says, brilliant, I'll be a dictator. And even Augustus, I mean, he famously tries to disguise the fact that he is at the head of a kind of great revolutionary process. And that's how he succeeds. So the idea that revolution is to be welcomed and proclaimed, the kind of revolution that you see, first of all, in the 11th century, which is manifest in all kinds of ways that people at the time find deeply destabilizing and unsettling. So whether it's the Pope insisting that kings have no stake in the dimension of the supernatural. I mean, this is really where the division between the ideas of religion and the secular are starting to be enshrined on a kind of structural societal level. Because up until this point, kings and emperors have taken for granted that, of course, I mean, they have a duty to interfere in the dimension of the supernatural. But the papacy and the Roman Church are saying, no, you can't do that. It's our responsibility. You stay in the dimension of the saeculum, which in Latin is basically the dimension of things that are born and live and die. The church is the guardian of the dimension of religio, this bond which joins humanity to the dimension of the eternal, which is unchanging. And that's what they're offering. But that's a very radical notion. And when it is illustrated by the emperor having to kneel in the snows outside a castle where the Pope is, I mean, that is shocking to everybody. And some people are appalled and some people, of course, are completely thrilled. And that the sense of excitement that enthusiasts for this new cycle of Reformatio, it blazes in all kinds of ways that will become very familiar over the subsequent centuries of European history. So it inspires a kind of a radical militancy that sees armed warriors head off to fight the Muslims in Spain and in the Holy Land and the pagans in the Balts, the Crusades. It inspires scholars to gather together from across Europe, forming what will come to be called universities, trying to structure frameworks of law that can govern this kind of radical new society that is emerging, trying to understand what it is that Christ wants and the church wants, with absolutely momentous consequences. And of course, it also generates people who worry that this revolution hasn't gone far enough, but it also generates a backlash. It generates counter-reformation. There are people who think this is awful, what's going on? And both of these groups of people will come to be classed as heretics. And again, the idea of people who are impatient with a revolutionary movement for not going far enough and who are appalled that it's happened in the first place. I mean, these are both categories of people that we can see throughout subsequent periods of European history.
And that word secular, which, as you say, it's part of this story. So we tend to think of it as stepping outside of this story, but it is absolutely integral to this story. And it's part of that endless turning of the wheel, the revolution. And counter-revolution is trying to stop the wheel from turning, but it's either turning too fast or you want to arrest it. And yet it's come to mean in the modern world for people sort of getting off that cycle. They can see what they think of as the craziness of it and the bloodshed that follows from it. Someone wants to turn the wheel faster, someone wants to arrest the turning of the wheel, and they each end up killing each other. And the secular is thought to be a way of thinking or a way of understanding the world which rescues us from that endless cycle. And yet you're arguing that it is integrally part of the same story. So is it always an illusion on the part of the people who feel that there is, and maybe it doesn't have to revolve around the word secular. There are other words too, including enlightenment is another word, radical enlightenment and so on. These are all part of the story and they're all attempts to step outside of the story. So there's something paradoxical going on there too. But is it always the case that the people who think, I want to get off the ride, this is madness. They were right at the beginning. It's madness. And I want to find a place and a way of understanding which insulates me from this endless need to keep turning the wheel. Are they deluding themselves because they're just still inside, they're still inside the wheel?
I think for most of European history, it is a delusion to imagine that you can emancipate yourself from the heritage of the Christian past. I think it is just, it saturates our society and our assumptions so utterly that is really, really difficult even to recognize that they're assumptions. And I do think that the notion of the secular is a perfect example of that, because so many societies and indeed individuals who are proud of their emancipation from religion, from superstition, from Christianity, are kind of bound to a concept that would be unthinkable without the Christianity that gave birth to it. And to trace how, this idea of the saeculum as, it's the expression of a fallen world in which everything, whether it's individuals or empires, are bound to collapse in the long run because nothing that is human can last forever. And that over the course of the Middle Ages and into the Reformation and the Enlightenment, it comes to mean something fairly different, a safe space from what is no longer religio, but in English, religion. And religion has come to mean something that is both very private to you. So it's a kind of very, England has become Protestant. And so it's unsurprising that the language the English speak comes to reflect Protestant assumptions. This idea of religion as something private that is individual. It doesn't need the mediation of a church or anything. You can look into your heart and decide what your relationship with God properly should be. But simultaneously is something that is proper to a nation. So, what religion are the English? What religion are the Scots? What religion are the French? I mean, these are questions that the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the wars of religion radically come to pose. And then in the 18th century, when Europeans start to go out into the world, and perhaps the British most obviously, because they go to one of the other great wombs of religion alongside the Middle East, which is India. And the Persians call it Hindustan, and the British, when they first arrived there, are speaking Persian. And so they call the inhabitants of India the Hindus. And people say, well, what is the religion of the Hindus? I mean, it's a mad question because they don't have any, there aren't religions in India. They don't have any concept of the secular. They don't have any concept of religions. But over the course of the Raj, because the Indian upper classes come to speak English, they absorb these very Christian notions. And when independence happens, India is proclaimed a secular republic. And the idea of secularism is enshrined at the heart of the new Indian state as a way of kind of preserving religious harmony. There's the idea that there is something called Hinduism, something called Islam, that Jainism, Buddhism, that they can all be kind of kept in a kind of at a distance from each other. And I think what you see in India now is a reminder that secularism is not a natural state of affairs. I mean, it's not a given. It's not something that just exists. It's a very culturally contingent assumption. And it's really telling, I think, that Modi, who promotes Hindutva, the idea that all of India properly is a manifestation of the Hindu understanding of the universe and the cosmos, he doesn't really speak English. So in a sense, his assumptions haven't been influenced in that way. And it's a reminder to us in the West that as our economic and our military power retreats, so also is our cultural power retreating. And I think that it will become harder and harder for people in the West over the coming century to assume that our assumptions, our way of seeing the world, can be equated to human nature. It's not. And whether it's Modi in India or whether it's Erdogan in Turkey, I mean, lots of other examples, the idea that secularism is neutral, I think, is going out of the window. Secularism is radically distinctive to a particular European way of seeing the world.
And it also contains within it a version of one of these paradoxes, because as you described it, some of the motivation there is to create a safe space from the madness. But the way to do that is to say, let's make religion a private matter, or let's at least try and put that in a space where we can see it and contain it. So that then leaves the secular as the domain in which the fighting has to happen. And it is one of the things that continues, I think, to surprise and baffle people. That I don't want to use the language of safe space in a too loaded way, but these secular realms, which are meant to be where you're protected from that original craziness, don't feel safe at all, because you have loaded that space up with the arguments and you've pushed the religion away.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the kind of classic manifestation of that's the French Revolution, which in so many ways is clearly a Christian phenomenon. Again, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. The kind of apocalyptic reckoning in which a new Jerusalem will descend to the earth and all of that. But the revolutionaries, once they have decided that Christianity is too implicit in the crimes of kingship to be redeemed, they can't do the Protestant maneuver and say, well, we're going back to a kind of primordial church. So they need a kind of new revolutionary justification. And so this is where the idea of the secular is something that is nothing to do with Christianity, is an emancipation of Christianity, comes to be enshrined, even though laïcité, the French word for secularism, it derives from the Greek word laos, which is the word that is used by the church for the Christian people. So it's, even even French as in English, the Christian assumptions are kind of evident. And that imposes huge strains on peoples who are not Christian. And the first people to experience that, of course, are the Jews, who up until the French Revolution have always defined themselves as a people, as the people of Israel. They do not think of themselves as belonging to something called Judaism, which is a Christian neologism dating back to the 2nd century AD. But no Jewish writers up until the 19th century ever used the word Judaism or think of themselves as belonging to a religion. But it becomes one of the conditions of citizenship, first in France and then in the various European countries that come to adopt the assumptions of the revolution, that Jews can have citizenship, but they have to accept that they are not a separate people. They belong to whatever nation they are citizens of. And therefore, they're different to Christians to the degree that they belong to a different religion rather than to a nation. And that is, Jews respond to that by creating a kind of Protestantized form of what previously had not been thought by them as religion. So whether it's Reform or Orthodox, they're both equally, neither of them are Orthodox. And I think you see the same stresses since the Second World War with Muslims who've come to Europe and who are told you can have freedom of religion. That's fine. You can have freedom of religion. But Muslims classically, again, have not thought of Islam as a religion. Islam is an all-encompassing way of life. It's the air that you breathe if you're a Muslim. It impregnates every aspect of how you should live. And that is not what secular states in the West are offering Muslims. Again, Muslims have to kind of recalibrate the classical understanding of Islam and reconfigure it as a kind of a Western, as understood by the West, a religion. And I think that a lot of the strains that exist in Western multicultural societies derive from the fact that secularism is plainly not neutral, and yet everyone has to pretend that it is, because otherwise it won't work.
And it's also, in that story, clearly not a place of greater safety. There are many words you could use for the experience of what follows, but a safe place is not one of them. In the story of the Jews, the story of secularism is not a story of greater safety.
Well, of course, the great shadow that hangs over that story is the Holocaust. And again, that is rife with the grimmest possible paradoxes, because unlike the French revolutionaries or the Bolsheviks, the fascists, I think, they're happy to let the churches carry on, like in a kind of wraith-like form. But unlike the French or the Russian revolutionaries, they attack Christian ideology at its root. And in particular, they attack two doctrines that, for the length of Christian history, people have not really sought to overthrow. And one of these is the idea that all human beings inherently have a kind of, a similar dignity, that there is no Jew or Greek, as Paul put it. And the other is what you fixed on right at the beginning, the idea that there is a kind of strength in weakness. And the fascists overtly repudiate that. They are a fusion of the pre-Christian and the post-Christian. They identify with the swagger and the glamour and the cruelty of ancient Greece and Rome. And they look to a modernized world of fast cars and airplanes that, again, seems to have nothing to do with Christianity. And they target the Jews. Obviously, they are drawing on Christian traditions of anti-Semitism. At the Nuremberg rally, the first Nuremberg rally after the Nazis come to power, Luther's diatribe against the Jews is the subject of a special exhibition at that. So there's no question that those traditions of anti-Semitism feed into the Nazis' anti-Semitism. But Hitler and Himmler give it a kind of peculiar spin, because Hitler, one of the reasons why he says that the Jews have to be eliminated is because he thinks that the Greeks and the Romans, certainly their elites, were Aryan, and that the civilization of Greece and Rome was destroyed by the ressentiment of Jews, of whom the most sinister was Paul, and that Christianity is a kind of Jewish cancer that destroyed the grandeur and the glory of classical civilization, and that if the Reich is to last for 1,000 years, then they have to eliminate the Jews, because otherwise something similar will happen again. And so the Nazis practiced genocide against the Jews because they blamed the Jews for Christianity. I mean, and you couldn't think of, we've been talking about paradoxes, you couldn't think of a darker paradox than that.
The other thing that's true, in part at least, of the Nazi story is that it contains a bastardized version of evolutionary theory, which includes the idea that not only is there no universal dignity, but maybe there isn't anything particularly special about humanity. I mean, that's not a view of all Nazis, but it was a view of some, including Himmler, I believe.
And Hitler as well.
Yeah, and in this story as it unfolds, it seems every time it allows human beings to try and step outside of it, it sort of grabs them back in. It's this rolling story in which you think you're outside of the web and the web ensnares you again. But evolutionary theory is at least potentially where you do step outside, because a Christianity without the idea there's something special about the human is impossible, isn't it? There are points at which, even in this story, as it unfolds, Darwin was a Christian. It starts as, you can certainly see this is part, at least in origin, of the story. And as it unfolds, this may be one bit where you do step outside.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Darwin doesn't coin the phrase survival of the fittest, but that is how it comes to be understood. And it serves the needs of, imperial Europe perfectly, because it provides what seems to be a scientific justification for their dominance of the world. They dominate the world. They do it because they are the fittest, self-evidently. And this feeds into Nazi ideology in a way that is so hideous that in the wake of the Second World War, it becomes very difficult for people, even as they kind of enthusiastically proclaim themselves to be Darwinists and enthusiasts for science, to kind of stare into the implications of this. So the most celebrated popularizer of Darwinist theory, probably writing in English, Richard Dawkins, is also very hostile, famously, to established religion. But his assumptions and his morals are plainly derived from Christianity. I mean, he's a kind of universalist, he's a liberal, he's all those kind of things. And the fact that a world in which humans have no particular status, they're just organisms, material organisms like anything else, and that even if survival of the fittest is a crude reduction and distortion of Darwinian theory, nevertheless, it does hint at something quite important, that species rise and fall dependent on how adapted they are to their environments, that this doesn't necessarily lend itself to the assumptions and the platitudes of contemporary progressives and liberals. Is a kind of unsettling thought that, I mean, certainly I've wrestled with a good deal over the past few decades, and it leaves me kind of torn between a kind of nihilist Nietzscheanism, a kind of despairing relativism, and a desire to kind of reach after Christian faith as a way of kind of clinging onto something solid.
Yeah, you can escape from the web, but it's not a comfortable place to be. It's bleak out there.
No, it is a bleak place, I think.
Last question. As you said, the West is built on this story, and the West is, for that reason, a story of continuing and continuous revolutions, but we may be entering a non-Western dominated century. Nonetheless, that core idea where we started, that there is strength in weakness, that there is glory in victimhood, the universal idea that therefore we can all find our way in. I find it hard to believe in the 21st century that's not going to continue to do some revolutionary work. Whatever happens to the dominance of the West, as we fade away, that idea feels like it's going to outlast us.
I think it's possible that liberalism has, if you like, it's Christianity was the kind of the space rocket, with the blasters to get you through outside the atmosphere. And now it's something, it's been cast aside, and the kind of the space shuttle of progressivism has enough energy and blast force to continue through space on its own motion. I mean, I have to say, I think that proposition has come to look a little less certain over the past few years. Another possibility is that we might take a kind of Nietzschean turn again. I mean, I think that the memories of fascism have served, like kind of garlic to the vampire of that. But as living memory of the Nazis kind of passes into history, it may well be that the notion that might is right will come to be enshrined back in the heart of the West. And another possibility is that people who want to hold on to these myths and believe that they're true may turn back to the ultimate wellspring, which is kind of unapologetically a mythology in which the supernatural governs it. And it's worth saying that we've talked about Christianity as though it's a Western religion. Of course, it isn't at all. I mean, I haven't really talked about the orthodoxy, but even more, the spread of Christianity in Africa, in parts of Asia, is enormous. I mean, it's another kind of great tidal spread, and Christianity there isn't going anywhere.
Actually, I think I was thinking of a fourth possibility, which is not progressivism continues with the rockets dropping away, but that the revolutionary potential of the paradox, that there is strength in weakness, that idea, its revolutionary potential rather than its progressive, I feel like Nietzsche, it's progressive dead weight, which is, it doesn't feel like a rocket, it feels more like a sort of blanket. But that other thing, which runs through the 2,000-year story, which is that just when things seem settled, something blows up.
But I think it's blowing up at the moment. I mean, I think whatever it is we're living through at the moment, it feels like what you might call a reformation. I mean, and it took people who lived through the Reformation about 150 years to realize that they'd lived through something called the Reformation. And it may take, historians in 100 years to give a name to what we're going through at the moment. But I mean, I think it is an incredible period of ethical and moral ferment. I mean, unbelievable process of moral change. And who knows where it will go, because it's kind of emancipated itself from the moorings of biblical scripture and church practice. It's basically running on vibes, on Christian vibes. And that means it's careering off in all kinds of mad directions. And who knows where it will continue to crash around and end up in. I don't know, but be interesting to watch.
You can, of course, hear more from Tom Holland on a little podcast he has called The Rest is History. If you would like to read more by him about the things that we were talking about in today's episode, I really do recommend his book, Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. It is extraordinary. A reminder that if you'd like to hear part 2 of my conversation with Agnes Callard about Socrates and all the things that Socrates changed, you can get it on PPF+. To subscribe, just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. If you sign up, there are now 21 bonus episodes available for you today, accompanying all of the series that we've put out this year. Bonus episodes on American elections with Gary Gerstle, on British elections with Robert Saunders, bonus episodes with Leah Ippey on the history of freedom, bonus film episodes, bonus fiction episodes, all of it available now, and the listening is ad-free. It's £5 a month or £50 for the year. Do please sign up. Coming next on the history of revolutionary ideas, I'm going to be talking to the leading Islamic scholar and theologian Timothy Winter about what changed in the world with the advent of Islam. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.